Hey good folks, Ram here for Tuts Plus, and welcome to the Closeup tutorial. Presuming that you've already seen the showcase, we can immediately start. As you can see, I've already have a folder set up over here at the project section. I've got an assets folder. Inside it I have a sequence folder and a stills folder. I've got a compositions folder, which contains a pre-comps folder and a render comps folder. In the render comps folder, I have already set up a new composition called main comp. As you can see, it's a 1280 by 720, 25 frame rate, and a duration of 30 seconds. Other than that, we have a solids folder. Let's take a quick peek at the project settings. We can access the project settings window by clicking on the text here, 32 BPC. You probably see 8 BPC. Or we can go to File, and it's underneath the recording area here. Just above Exit, we've got Project Settings. So you can either click that or just click on the 32 BPC or 8 BPC as you see it on your computer. We are interested in the color settings section. In the default settings, the depth is set to 8 bits, the working space to none, and we want to work in a minimum value of 16 bits per channel, but I rather work in 32 bits. The reason for that is that you get a lot more divisions of color when working with 16 bits, and even more than that with 32 bits. This is very important for the workflow we are going to use, and you'll see why in a few minutes. We'll set the working space to sRGB, linearized workspace. If you're not familiar with linearized workspace, I highly recommend you Google that. There's a lot of tutorials and various kinds of explanations on linearized workspace, and I'm not going to get into that in this tutorial. Let's check out the showcase for a second and see how we can start rebuild it. The iris, which is the blue part, is floating in real After Effects 3D space, and it's basically a solid with the plugin Freeform Pro by Mettle, and I'm using a depth map to extrude this shape here. Above that we have the sclera, the transparent part that holds the reflection, and that's created with another layer of Freeform Pro. If you're using After Effects CS4 or less, you can use the built-in Freeform. If you're using CS5 or higher, you can use Freeform or Freeform Pro. Let's get rid of the preview here. We'll start off by creating the depth map with which we will extrude the shape. To start creating our depth map, we'll need to first start by creating a fractal noise layer, but we will create it in a new composition. Control N to create a new composition. We'll call it fractal 1, and we'll make it 3000 pixels in width and 400 in height. We can close the assets, open up the comps folder, and we'll place fractal 1 in pre-comps folder. Okay, we like to keep things nice and clean. So create a new layer, Control Y to create a new layer. The color doesn't matter, and we'll make sure it's in the comp size. We'll hit make comp size and hit OK. We'll rename this layer to fractal, and we'll apply fractal noise. I would like to convert this fractal into vertical lines. So let's see. We'll first go to transform, uncheck uniform scaling. So this way I can control the X and Y scale separately. And we'll leave the width scale at 100, and we'll raise the height scale very high, approximately 5000. So I get nice straight vertical lines. We can add a bit more complexity here, so let's raise it all the way to 20. We can use a bit more contrast here, so let's set it to 150. And we got a bit more contrast, as you can see. Very nice. So back to main comp, and we'll drag our fractal 1 here. And we'll apply the CC sphere effect. And that will make it a sphere. We'll need it a bit larger than it is at the moment. Let's say around this size should be fine. And we want to rotate it. Let's see, rotation, rotate it on the x-axis to 90 degrees. So this is the base of our depth map. At the moment we have some shading issues here. So let's see, let's open up the shading and we'll set the ambient to 0. And in the light section, we'll set the light height to 100. So the illumination covers the whole of the sphere. This is the base for our work. I would like to create a few more of these spheres, and I would like to add some variation to them. So for that purpose, we will go back to our project section and we'll duplicate fractal 1 3 more times. We'll duplicate fractal 1 at the main comp section and we'll replace it with fractal 2. So mark fractal 2 in the project section and alt drag to fractal 1, and that way they switch between them. And now we can go inside fractal 2 and apply some changes here. First of all, I would like fractal 2 composition to be a lot smaller. Instead of making it 3000 in width, we'll make it 400 in width. So we got a perfect square. And the reason I'm doing this is that once we'll apply CC sphere to this composition, it would stretch it out and I will get much more interesting shape. Let's make sure that the layer is the same size as our composition. We'll hit Ctrl-Shift-Y and that would pop up the solid settings window, and we'll hit the Make Comp Size button. Okay, let's apply some variations here. First of all, we'll set the contrast to be a bit less. Let's say 110 should be fine. In the transform section, we'll add a few more steps to the height. Let's say 5500 should be fine here. We'll go to the sub settings and we'll set the sub scaling to be a bit less. Let's say 40. Now let's go back to our main comp. And as you can see, since the composition is a lot smaller, we got a lot more details in the center than we do in the edges of the sphere. That's because the edges are stretched to wrap the sphere. Usually that's not an outcome you would like, but in this case it is. So that's fractal 2. Now let's prepare the other two fractals and we can move on to combine those as a depth map. We'll duplicate fractal 2. We'll actually duplicate it 2 times. And we'll switch the third one with fractal 3. Again, alt click and drag, make sure that the right layer is selected, and when we let go it switches with the right composition. We'll do the same with fractal 4. Now let's go to fractal 3. Again, we want the composition to be 400 by 400, and we'll make sure that the layer is set to composition size. Okay, and let's see. This time around I would like the fractal type to be dynamic. We'll raise the contrast to about 180 and we'll make it a bit darker. So let's say minus 30 should be fine. We'll set the scale width to be a bit higher, let's say around 300. And we'll set the scale height to be around 700, maybe even 750. So I'm looking for a more organic type of result here. Open up the sub settings. We'll set the sub influence percent to 80, so we get a lot more details here. And we'll set the sub scaling to be around 70, maybe even 65. Yeah, maybe we can rotate it a bit. It gets distorted a bit and I really like this look we get here. Let's move on to fractal 4. For fractal 4, we'll set the composition, Ctrl K to access the composition settings, and we'll set the width to 800. And again, we'll need to change the layer size, Ctrl Shift Y, and we'll set it to comp size. Okay. Again, I would like the fractal type to be dynamic. We are again looking for something a bit more organic. We'll leave the contrast as it is. We'll make it just a little bit darker. Something of this sort should be fine. We'll set the scale. Actually, you know what? We'll set it to uniform scaling, and we'll set the scale to the minimum, which is 20. So we get a very small shapes here. So this is about it for our fractals. We can close now the fractal windows. Control W to close windows. As you can see, these are our fractals. This is number 4, 3, 2, and 1. Now they all share one problem, which you can see very clearly in fractal 3. We get a seam here, and once we'll convert all of these into a depth map, we would be able to see that really clearly. So we need to get rid of this seam here. The easiest way of doing that, let's start with fractal 3, since we can see it more clearly there. Double click on it, and we'll apply a mirror effect to it. So that's under distort, mirror. Close the fractal noise, and we'll set it to be straight in the middle, so that will be 200. And we got a perfect mirror of the left side here. And as you can see, we got rid of this seam here. We'll need to apply this effect to the rest of the compositions. Let's do that for the fractal 4 here as well. And since it's a different size of composition, we'll need to change it to be straight in the middle, which is 400. And for this one, we can actually rotate it to 90 degrees. Okay. We'll apply it to number 2 as well, and to number 1. Now this one is 3000 pixels in width, which means it needs to be at 1500. Now let's start combining these spheres. Let's start off by creating a new layer. We'll hit Ctrl Y to create a new layer, and we'll make it black. We'll call this layer pupil, and we'll make it 300 by 300, and we'll apply a circle mask to it. Select the ellipse tool and double click on it to create a perfect circle. Let's go into the mask option by double clicking on M, and we'll set the mask feather to 20, and we'll set the mask expansion to be a bit less, something around -30. So this will be our pupil, and as you can see, we're starting to get a very nice result here. Something that's starting to look like a human eye. Let's get rid of these for a second. I would like fractal 2 to be the base sphere, and we'll set fractal 1. Let's switch to modes by hitting F4, and I'll switch the transfer mode to something like overlay or maybe lighten. Let's see, lighten works nicer. Very nice, we get some highlights here. Fractal 3, we'll set it to something like overlay again, or maybe soft light. Soft light works nicer. By the way, I'm switching between the modes by hitting Shift plus or Shift minus. This result is a very nice result. We can actually duplicate fractal 3. Now remember, when working with depth maps, black values are concaved and white values or brighter values are convex. We can actually rotate the second one to 180. That will give us some nicer results here. Let's bring in fractal 4. Fractal 4 gives us a very rough concaved and convex shapes, and I do like to have those, only I wouldn't like to have those so rough, especially around the middle part here. So what I will do here is create a mate for it. I'll create a new solid, Ctrl Y, and I'll set the height to 720, same as the composition height, and I'll set the width to be 720 as well, so we get a perfect square, straight in the middle and covering the whole of the iris here, and we'll apply a circle mask to it. Double clicking on it will make a perfect circle mask. We'll actually need to set it beneath the pupil. And let's double click on M here, and M. We'll feather it out a bunch. We'll say around 70 pixels. And we'll set the expansion to somewhere around here. We'll rename this to mate. And we'll set the fractal 4 to alpha inverted mate. So if we'll solo that, this is what we get here. Now, let's see. The fractal 4 is still a bit rough. We'll hit T to access the opacity, and we'll set it to about 25%. And that will take care of the contrast here. And we'll set its transfer mode to darker color. I would also like to soften up the edges here, which are at the moment a bit too rough, and that would cause some trouble further down the line. We'll create a new layer, Control Y, and we'll call this layer Edge. We'll make it comp size. The color doesn't matter at the moment. We'll set Edge again beneath the pupil, and we'll apply to it Circle effect. Let's solo it to see what's going on. The circle effect is just a white circle, and we can't see it here because the pupil is covering it. So let's hide the pupil for a second. We'll set the radius to be a lot higher than it is at the moment. Let's see. We want to reach the edges here. So that's maybe 350. That's maybe too much. Let's try it a bit less. 48, maybe 47. Just till we'll see the edges here. Okay, that's a bit above the edges. We can actually set it to difference, and that way we can see where's the edge. 47 is just a few pixels above the edge, and that would leave us some gap to play with. Set the transfer mode again to normal. We'll set the edge from none to thickness, and we'll set the thickness to 0. Toggle down feather, and now we get an option of feathering the inner edge and the outer edge. We'll set the outer edge to 0, and we want to feather in the inner edge. So we get a nice feathering going on here, let's say 55 or so. We'll get some nice convexing effect here on the edges. Very sweet. Let's bring back the pupil. We are actually starting to get a very nice result here, and I would like to add some more details and maybe blur this out a bit. But before we get into that, let's put this depth map to the test. Mark all the layers, Control A, and we'll pre-compose those, Control Shift C. We'll call this composition Iris Depth Map, and we'll hit OK. To the Iris Depth Map, we'll apply Freeform Pro. We'll create a new camera here as well, Control Alt Shift C to create a new camera, and we'll use the 35mm preset. Hit OK. And let's see. We can actually rename this one to Iris. We'll drag in the Iris depth map again to our composition, and we'll shut down the eye for it. Let's place it in the pre-comps folder. We'll go to our effect. We'll go to displacement mapping, and we'll set displacement layer to Iris depth map. Okay, and we'll set the displacement height to 70. So we get nice displacement going on here. Obviously, we've got a few issues here we need to solve. So first, we'll enable polygon alpha. That would use the depth map alpha as an alpha channel. Other than that, we'll need to go to the tessellation, toggle that down, and we'll mark adaptive. And what that does is letting the Freeform Pro plugin apply more polygons or more information where you get more complex shapes, and where you have less complex shapes, it uses less polygons. And all in all, the result is a bit more smoother and a bit nicer, as you can see here. Let's go back to our ice depth map. Let's see what else can we add here to make it look nicer. So first I would like to add a bit more information here. We got some very nice information going on here, but I would like to add a bit more veins here. You can actually look at this one. As you can see, we got some various veins going on here along the iris, and I would like to recreate that here. So let's see. To do that, we'll create a new shape layer. We can do that by either going to layer, new, shape layer, or by making sure that nothing is selected in our composition and choosing the pen tool and simply start to draw. I'll bring in the title safe by alt-clicking this button here, and there's my middle, and I'll draw a simple line. So from this point to approximately this point. Okay, we can turn that off. I'll set the stroke width to 17 or 18 or something of that sort, and we'll set its color to light gray. And that reminds me that I forgot to do the same for the edge here. Let's see, I want the color not to be white, but something of this sort. Some very light gray. Okay, and again, this one is a bit too bright, so something of this sort should be fine. Now, I would like to duplicate this shape all along the iris here. So, we'll toggle down the shape layer, and we can actually call this veins 1. And we'll click on add, and we'll add a repeater. We'll repeat, let's say, 100 times. Let's toggle down the transform for the repeater 1. We'll set its position to 0. So all the copies are in the same place. And now we'll rotate it to, let's say, -11, maybe -12. And we got more copies here than we actually need, so let's get rid of some of those copies. Okay, so 30 copies is all we need. Next, I would like to give those straight lines a more wiggly shape. So again, we'll click on add, and we'll choose wiggle path. And you can see it because it's underneath the coding area, but trust me, it's there. We'll play around with this size until we get a nice wiggle going on. Something of this sort. We'll set the points from corner to smooth. We get a nice smooth result here. At the moment, the wiggle is animatable, so we need to get rid of that. We'll set the wiggle per second to 0, and that gets rid of the animation. At the moment, all the lines are virtually identical, and the reason for that is that the wiggle path is beneath the repeater, so we can change that order. And as you can see now, all the lines have different values, and we can lower the size of the wiggle, and now we get a much more interesting vein-like result. Let's set the opacity to be lower. Hit T to reveal the opacity, and we'll set it to 10, so it's blending in a bit nicer. Obviously it needs to be beneath the pupil, and we'll blur those, but not at the moment. At the moment we'll leave those as is, and we'll set it beneath factor 4 and 3, so they will blend in a bit nicer, as you can see here. Okay, and let's duplicate this one, and let's toggle down the shape, and we'll choose stroke, and we'll set the stroke width to 1. So if we'll isolate those for a second, as you can see, we got some variations here. We can even add a bit more shapes here to the repeater. Let's see. This is nicer. Okay, let's unsolo these. Now it's time to start blurring things out a bit here. Let's add a new adjustment layer, Control Alt Y. We'll drag it to be just above the veins. We'll rename this adjustment layer to blur, and we'll apply fast blur to it. We'll make it 5. So at the moment, the adjustment layer is blurring the two veins layer and the first two fractals. The layers above it are not blurred, so we get a nice variation here. And as you can see, this is starting to look very, very nice. Let's back up a bit here and create a light so we can see how that works. Control Alt Shift L to create a new light. We'll use a spotlight, and the intensity is 1000, which is extremely high. We'll set it to 100 and hit OK. And as you can see, we get a very nice lighting going on here. Let's see, the color is a bit yellow, I think. So let's double click on the light and let's see. Yeah, it's a bit yellow and I want it to be perfectly white. Okay, there it is. And as you can see, that really brings out all the details to the surface. As you can see, we do get some anti-aliasing going on here, and that's due to the layers which are not blurred. Okay, let's continue on and see what else can we do here. First, let's go to Factor 4 and isolate it for a second. I would like to gain a bit more from this layer. So first I would like to lighten it up a bit. We'll add levels to it. And we'll brighten it up. Something of this sort. And now I would like to get a bit more contrast out of it. So curves will give me the contrast I need. We'll darken the dark areas and brighten the bright areas, and we get a lot more contrast here. We can actually brighten this a bit more. And let's unsolo this and see how that affects our layer. We can really see the influence it creates, and it's a very nice influence. I do like the way it looks. However, it's a bit too rough. So we'll add a fast blur here. And we'll set it to 5. And that softens up everything and it looks very nice. Great, let's continue on. We got the vein edges going over the edge here, so we'll need to take care of that. Mark our shape and we'll drag this one a bit higher until we get rid of the outer shape here. And we'll do the same for veins 2, and that takes care of that. And now let's apply a new adjustment layer. Control Alt Y, and we'll call this one CC for color correction. Let's apply levels here, and I would like to brighten up the entire image here. And we'll add a fast blur to add just a little bit of a blur to the entire image. We'll just add 1 to the blurriness. And I would also like to blur out a bit more the edges. So I will add an effect called edge blur. We'll set the blur amount to 8. So we get a nice blur only on the edges. Before we get to animation, I would like to add some color to the eye. So to do that, I'll duplicate the iris depth map, Control D to duplicate, and I'll rename it to iris color map. Let's create a new folder here and we'll call it maps. The point here is to keep things tight and clean. So we got a folder for maps. Okay, let's go into color map. Let's go to Fractal 2 and isolate it, and let's add to it a tint effect. And we'll set map black to a nice blue color. I'm gonna make nice blue eyes. A blue-green sort of a thing. Now let's isolate Fractal 1. And we'll add to it a fill effect. And I'm just gonna fill it with something close to that, but maybe a bit more lighter color, something of this sort. That looks nice. And we'll set the transfer mode to color. And if we'll unisolate it, we can see we start to get a very nice variation of colors here. We'll leave the veins white, and we can get rid of the blur here. Let's go to fractal free and add another fill effect, and we'll set this one to green, a very nice mid-tone green, and we'll set the transfer mode to multiply. Let's hit T and change the opacity to 25, so we get a nice back shade of green. Let's go to fractal 4 here, and let's close these. We can add a tint effect here as well, and we'll choose a nice green color here. Okay, and we'll set it to multiply as well. Let's hit T, and we'll set the opacity to somewhere around 50, so we get around the edges a nice green color. We can even increase that a bit more. Nothing too drastic. This looks nice. And maybe a bit of a more darker green, something of this sort. Okay, maybe set it to 65. That looks actually very nice. Let's set fractal free. Let's see what transfer mode works better here. Overlay for the second fractal noise gives us a very nice transition of colors here. I really like the way this looks. Maybe we can add a bit more. Let's say 75. Yeah, actually 70 might work better. Next, the edge is not necessary here. We actually don't need it. The color correction here, most of it is really not necessary. We don't really need the levels here, and we don't really need the fast blur. I will leave the edge blur as it is. So actually, let's just rename this layer to edge blur. And we'll add another adjustment layer, Ctrl-Alt-Y. And we'll rename this one to CC, because this one will be the color correction. And we'll just brighten it up a bit with the levels. Just brighten up a bit, and we'll drag the gamma a bit to the right, and we get a very interesting result here. Okay, great. So this one is the color map. Now let's go to our main composition. We'll mark the iris layer, which holds the Freeform Pro plugin. Making sure it's selected, I'll alt-click on the iris color map and drag it above the iris layer, and let's go. And the result here is very nice. Now, the whole thing looks a bit flat, and I would like to add a bit more of a convex in here. So I'll go back to the depth map, and I think I'll duplicate the edge, and I'll rename it to convex, and let's isolate it to see what's going on here. We'll change the edge from thickness to none. We'll feather it out a bunch, something of this sort, and we'll set the radius down. We might need to unsolo it to see how it affects the rest of the layers. And let's see, we can feather it out a bit more and maybe scale it down. Okay, and maybe set it transfer mode to something like lighten. Let's see how that affects our layer. Actually, you know what? Let's hide it for a second and we'll take a snapshot. And now let's bring it back and see how it affects. And you can immediately see you get a nice convex in here going on, and maybe it's a bit too rough. We can maybe lower the opacity a bit to say 90, so that's a bit nicer. We do have some anti-aliasing here. We might need to blur it a bit, so let's add fast blur, and we'll blur it by 5 maybe. See how that looks. That's much nicer. This brings to a conclusion the first part of the eye close-up tutorial. In this part, we've created the shape using a displacement map, we created a color map, and basically prepared our iris for animation. In the next part, we'll animate the different parts, including the camera null, the iris, the pupil, and several other objects in the scene. Once again, my name is Ram Ben Avraham, and I'll see you in the next part.